Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Altered Beast, a side-scrolling beat-em-up title, developed and published by Sega and released in arcades in 1988, with a number of home ports following. We're going to talk about that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 79. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We have great discussions. We do weekly gaming challenges. We do coins-based redemption for prizes. It's all out there. I highly encourage you to check it out. I also highly encourage you all to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewall, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, and Sean Marshall. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd just like to give a brief overview of the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign numerical rankings or star counts or anything like that, but we do look at every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, you should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play these titles today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. By all means, give it a go, but I cannot recommend these games to the broad gaming population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Altered Beast. Altered Beast is a side-scrolling beat-em-up title developed and published by Sega and released in arcades in 1988, with a number of home ports following in later years. Before we can talk about Altered Beast, we need to take a step back and look at the arcade industry of the 1980s, including its major players and the way that many of those groups developed titles. Because, unlike how the game industry evolved in the 90s and beyond, the 1980s saw the majority of top-tier games released in arcades, with the most popular receiving a port to home systems. Today, arcades are barely a thing, and certainly aren't the same as arcades of the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. But back in the 80s, the arcade scene was a booming business, and the majority of game development companies and publishers that today are insanely popular in the home console and computer game space initially were focused on creating arcade cabinets, not game cartridges. If we take a look at the arcade landscape in the 80s, several major players were responsible for the majority of arcade releases, and we'll talk a little bit about each of them throughout this episode. That's not to say that there weren't other developers out there, but for the purposes of focusing our discussion, we're going to talk about 5: Atari, Namco, Capcom, Konami, and last but not least, Sega. First though, it's probably important to refresh everyone's memory as to the state of the video game and arcade game industry of the 1970s into the early 80s. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm intentionally ignoring the microcomputer or PC market, since the numerous platforms and permutations in that space likely warrant a separate episode entirely. Anyway, back in the early 1970s, when the concept of digital video games was just beginning to be discussed outside of research labs and university think tanks, the term arcade meant something very different than it does today. Back then, arcades didn't have a ton of different arcade cabinets with various games ready to play. Instead, the majority of arcades were filled with mechanical machines, relying on physical manipulation of objects rather than digital representations of gaming experiences. Perhaps the most popular form of electromechanical entertainment of the time was the venerable pinball table, which would oftentimes be lined up along multiple walls of various arcade venues, simply because they were so in demand by the game-playing population. In fact, pinball was such a popular pastime that it would become the subject of a song by rock band The Who in 1969, entitled Pinball Wizard, which would eventually make its way to number 4 on the UK top music charts of the year. While part of that success was due to the catchiness of the song, the fact that a song by a popular rock band even exists is due to the popularity of pinball as a worldwide hobby. There were, of course, other mechanical arcade machines aside from pinball, like air hockey and skee-ball amongst others, and those mechanical machines took up the majority of the floor space in arcade game rooms of the early 1970s. That mechanical focus, however, would begin to shift in 1971, which is when the predecessor to Atari, Syzygy Engineering, created the very first digital video game arcade machine, Computer Space. That early effort, designed by eventual Atari co-founders Noah Bushnell and Ted Dabney, would be followed up a year later with Pong, the incredibly popular table tennis arcade game based on the Magnavox Odyssey's game Tennis. And the rest, as they say, is history, as Pong would effectively jumpstart the whole concept of a video game industry, and in turn would begin the shift for arcades to transform from physical, mechanics-based games into a den of digital experiences. Atari, given their position as the primary driver of those early arcade experiences, would go on to develop a ton of arcade machine concepts in the 1970s, with over 50 different games released between Pong's introduction in 1972 and the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, home console release in September of 1977. And with that home console release being one of the first systems to accept cartridges rather than having a selection of non-expandable built-in games, Atari would take advantage of their arcade pedigree, porting a number of their prior and future arcade titles directly onto the console. Atari would continue to develop arcade games, ports, and specific home console releases over the course of its lifetime, until its eventual sale in 1984, which ended up splitting up the company into several divisions. While the home console portion of the business would be rechristened as the Atari Corporation, all of its arcade game intellectual property and titles would be spun off as a separate corporate entity known as AT Games in 1985. AT Games would be co-owned by two different corporations, Warner Communications, who was the overall owner of Atari after their sale in 1984, and fellow arcade game development company Namco. Namco was a force in the amusement game space from as far back as the late 50s, and as arcades began to grow in popularity, Namco would create experiences for those venues, with a focus on electromechanical shooting gallery kinds of games, as well as pinball tables using a variety of themes and characters. In the early 70s, though, Namco would have an opportunity to expand into the video arcade game market through, interestingly, a partnership and eventual acquisition of a piece of Atari. As Atari began its rise to fame in 1973, the company expanded into a number of geographic areas outside of its United States home base, with one of the newly formed divisions being Atari Japan, which was meant to be a way for the company to more easily introduce its unique arcade video games into the Japanese arcade space, with the goal of creating arcade titles specifically for the Japanese market. The issue was, Atari didn't have any real distribution network in Japan, so they entered into discussions with Namco to become the sole distributor of Atari arcade games in Japan, a proposition that Namco agreed with. Unfortunately, though, Atari Japan was fraught with issues, including employee theft, general mismanagement, and little to no profit, so it didn't take long before Atari decided to sell the Japanese division of the company in its entirety, which is what led to Namco purchasing all of Atari Japan in the mid-70s, and in the process, becoming the largest arcade video game development studio in Japan. That purchase, though, did not result in an immediate success, as the Japanese arcade game market was not quite as receptive to digital video game experiences as what the United States market had been. It would take several years before Namco began to get some traction with their games, with the first pivot point for the company being their local port of the Atari game Breakout, which was so popular that it almost single-handedly created the concept of video game piracy across the industry. The second pivot point for Namco was actually its transition into a direct developer of video games, as opposed to being focused primarily on ports of existing titles. This would lead to the release of the space shooter Galaxian in 1979, and more importantly, the creation of Pac-Man in 1980. The development and importance of Pac-Man undoubtedly warrants its own podcast episode in the future, but for now, just recognize that Pac-Man was the biggest release in the video game industry up to this point, and is quite possibly the most significant release in video game history, as it was one of the first titles that appealed to a broad demographic, as opposed to targeting predominantly male gamers. Its success is almost unfathomable, as over the course of its lifetime, it has amassed over $14 billion in total revenue, which places it squarely in the list of top-selling video games of all time. And for Namco, that success meant one thing. It was time to keep making more games. And that's exactly what Namco did, working on and releasing classic arcade titles like Galaga, Xevious, Pole Position, and Tower of Draga in the years following Pac-Man's release. While Namco would begin shifting some of its attention to the home console market in 1984, spurred on primarily by the success of Nintendo's Famicom system, the company would remain a mainstay in the arcade industry throughout its entire history, and over the course of the company's lifetime, it would publish over 300 titles for arcades around the world. I'd argue that Namco's games, perhaps more so than any other arcade publisher's titles, are what many people think of when they think about the classic arcade experience. They were an incredibly influential company, and one that effectively bridged the gap between the video arcade and home console market, achieving significant success and recognition along the way. If Namco is synonymous with the classic arcade experience, then Konami and Capcom are almost synonymous with the next stage of arcade game development, which from my perspective stretched from the early to mid-80s through to the end of the decade. Both companies had some moderate success with earlier arcade titles, most notably with games like Frogger, 1942, and Ghosts and Goblins, but it would be the later 80s that really saw both companies rise to prominence. For Capcom, that worldwide household name level of success would start in 1987, which is when the very first Street Fighter title was released. Designed by Takashi Nishiyama, the influential game designer responsible for the very first side-scrolling beat-em-up title, Kung Fu Master, Street Fighter would take the traditional beat-em-up formula and reimagine the experience as a series of one-on-one boss fights, and in the process, would evolve the fighting game genre beyond prior efforts like Karate Champ. After Street Fighter, Capcom would begin releasing a steady stream of arcade hits, like Final Fight, which was originally intended to be a sequel to Street Fighter, and Street Fighter 2, which was the true sequel to Street Fighter that would propel Capcom to superstardom. That release is a bit beyond the scope of our immediate discussion, as I'm focusing right now on the arcade landscape of the 80s, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention Street Fighter 2 as the title that really put Capcom on the map. Of course, Capcom wouldn't just rest on their laurels as the years progressed, as they would become the company responsible for creating a number of incredibly successful franchises over the course of their history, with game series like Resident Evil and Monster Hunter selling tens of millions of copies for the home market over the years. Konami's history followed a similar but slightly less linear timeline than Capcom, as Konami began creating arcade titles in the early 80s, with some beloved releases like Frogger and Q*bert, before really finding their niche with the side-scrolling shooter genre, which they popularized with the release of Gradius in 1985, and followed up with more personal combat-centric shooting experiences like Russian Attack and Contra in the years that followed, which is the title that really thrust Konami into the spotlight. Though, interestingly, I would argue that Konami's success with Contra was mostly attributable to the eventual NES release of the title more so than the original arcade release. Regardless though, Konami from that point on was more widely known amongst the gaming community, and they took that newfound fame and translated it into a string of successful releases in the years that followed, with Konami remaining a prolific video game studio even today. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this was not meant to be an exhaustive look at all of the arcade publishers and developers of the 80s, as that would likely take us hours to go over. But I wanted to paint at least a little bit of a picture before we got to the star of today's episode, that being Sega. I'd venture a guess that while most people have awareness of the companies we've spoken about so far, like Atari, Namco, Konami, and Capcom, it would be Sega that likely has the most broad understanding and recognition. And it's not really hard to understand why. Sega began its existence in the early 60s, and from the point the company was founded, was always dedicated to delivering coin-operated entertainment experiences. Back in the 60s and early 70s, that primarily meant the creation of slot machines, pinball tables, and other electromechanical devices where players would interact with physical machines as opposed to digital screens in order to play games. One of their earliest arcade games, Periscope, demonstrates the kind of mechanical arcade games that the company of the time was known for. In Periscope, you take control of a submarine, with the goal of shooting other enemy submarines as they appear in your titular periscope. The game worked by displaying a cloudy backdrop of the horizon, which was literally a static image drawn on a canvas at the back of the arcade machine, separated by an expanse of plastic ocean waves. In front of that backdrop, a number of cardboard submarines would be pulled from right to left via a hidden chain under the plastic ocean, and your job was to look through your periscope, which provided a zoomed-in view of those submarines, and fire torpedoes as they entered your field of vision. Upon firing your torpedo, a light would zoom from your position under the ocean towards the submarine in the distance, and assuming you hit the submarine, you'd be met with a flash of light as the cardboard figure sank into the quote-unquote ocean. If you've never played Periscope, I highly encourage you to seek out a video on YouTube, because it's honestly pretty impressive how the Sega team was able to create an experience that, despite being entirely mechanical, mimics the kind of experience that would become more commonplace as the digital era of video games began to take over arcades in the later 70s. And as that digital era evolved, so too did Sega, as they progressed from electromechanical titles to more traditional digital arcade-styled cabinets. Unlike many arcade developers of the time, though, Sega's claim to fame wasn't a singular niche, but rather the sheer expanse and variety of experiences that Sega would create. In fact, Sega would create titles in nearly every genre you might be able to imagine, with games focused on racing, boxing, fighting, shooting, space, stealth, action, laserdisc, full-motion video, interactive films, and others, with almost 80 different arcade titles released before Sega's first home console, the SG-1000, was released in 1983. With the release of the SG-1000, Sega would enter into a perpetual war with Nintendo that would last for the next 12-ish years, as the Nintendo Famicom would release on the same day as the SG-1000. We've talked about that competitive landscape before on prior episodes of the podcast, so I'm not going to rehash that history right now, because it's not really pertinent to our current discussion. What is pertinent to our current discussion, though, is the continued evolution of Sega as an arcade game developer and publisher. And here, Sega would become one of, if not the, most prolific arcade game studio of the 80s and 90s. In fact, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, Sega does hold the record of being the most prolific arcade manufacturer ever, with over 500 games, 70 franchises, and 20 different arcade system boards created since 1981. That is an absolutely astronomical series of numbers, and goes to show how dedicated Sega was to their arcade business, which, despite their entrance into the home console space with the SG-1000, remained the focus of the company. Throughout the 80s, Sega would continue to innovate in the arcade space, and they even structured themselves to better meet the increasing demands of arcade goers around the world. While most arcade game companies might have several small teams working on games, Sega had 8 separate full-scale research and development, or R&D, divisions working on games and gaming technology, with 7 of those divisions being responsible for arcade titles, and 1 focused primarily on home consoles. Across those 7 primary arcade game divisions, 3 groups warrant special mention, with the group known as R&D 8 being perhaps the most influential and successful of the groups. That particular division of Sega was run by none other than Yu Suzuki, who is a literal genius in the video game development and design space. Suzuki, unlike many of his counterparts, had a focus not only on the creation of games as software, but also on the hardware components of titles, as many of his games combined unique gameplay mechanics with physical simulation-driven machines with state-of-the-art software techniques to create experiences that blew arcade gamers away. I'm talking about titles like 1985's Hang On, a motorcycle racing game that allowed players to literally ride on a pseudo-motorcycle, controlling the on-screen character movement by shifting their body weight from side to side, similar to how you would ride a motorcycle in real life. That title was one of the first full-body experience kinds of games, and it would spawn a number of follow-on efforts after its release, many of which were designed and created by Yu Suzuki's R&D 8 group. Beyond R&D 8, there was also the R&D 2 team, led by Mamoru Shigeta and Minoru Kanari, whose primary focus had been the creation of platform-styled titles for arcades, along with the home ports for those titles. Notable creations by that group include the Alex Kidd series, which actually was primarily a home console franchise, though one of its earliest entries did originate in the arcade space, as well as the Shinobi series, which was a collection of ninja-themed hack-and-slash games similar in concept to Tecmo's Ninja Gaiden. And finally, we come to R&D 1, a group led by Hisashi Suzuki and Yoji Ishii, 2 longtime Sega designers who, in comparison to the other R&D groups, had perhaps the longest tenure and most significant heritage out of anyone involved in Sega's arcade ventures. In fact, Hisashi Suzuki in particular warrants additional consideration, as Suzuki was the first actual documented employee of Sega, all the way back in 1960, and would become one of Sega's most notable engineers of electromechanical arcade titles, the precursor to the digital arcade games of the later 70s and 80s. A little bit ago, I mentioned the game Periscope, Sega's earliest arcade title, and one that used a series of mechanical parts, lights, and other physical effects to create the sensation of blowing up enemy submarines while looking at them through a periscope peripheral. Well, that game, along with many other Sega releases of the time, were engineered and designed by Hisashi Suzuki, undoubtedly a true legend in the company. That's not to say that there weren't other notable designers in the group, along with some individuals just getting their start in the video game industry. And one of those new Sega employees was a man named Makoto Uchida. Uchida joined Sega in 1987, and his first assignment was as a tester for the forthcoming arcade title Afterburner, which was one of Yu Suzuki's full-body experience simulation kinds of games, where individuals could actually sit in a pseudo-jet cockpit that moved and rotated as their in-game jet maneuvered around the screen. Uchida took the opportunity testing Afterburner to learn as much as he could about the arcade game creation process, and when the time came in 1988 for R&D 1 to begin deciding what games to work on for that year, Uchida would be tasked with leading the creation of one of those games. The only issue was, Uchida had to decide what kind of game he wanted to create. Now here, he ended up taking inspiration from a variety of popular media from the time, including the titles that were beginning to gain prominence in arcades around the world, most notably the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre that had gained significant attention following the release of Double Dragon in the summer of 1987. That game, while not the first beat-em-up title ever released, was the game that really popularized the genre, and Double Dragon's design would end up serving as the foundation for countless beat-em-up titles that would follow in later years. And interestingly, Double Dragon would serve as inspiration for Uchida, as he would decide that his first game would be some type of beat-em-up experience. Though for his part, Uchida didn't want to simply mimic titles like Double Dragon. He wanted to create his own unique experience. Looking across the pop culture landscape of the time, Uchida settled on two distinct inspirations for the content of his upcoming game. One was the 1981 werewolf horror film The Howling, while the other was Michael Jackson's 1983 zombie-themed music video to the hit song Thriller. While both The Howling and Thriller's music video were decidedly horror-themed, that wasn't really Uchida's focus for choosing those inspirations. What Uchida was really interested in was the act of transformation. For Uchida's game, he wanted to create an experience where players wouldn't simply inhabit a singular character's body and beat up a bunch of bad guys. Instead, Uchida wanted to create a game where the player character could evolve and transform into a number of different forms, each with their own powers and strengths, creating an experience that he believed would be more varied than other arcade beat-em-ups of the time. The only issue was, this was the first game that Uchida was officially in charge of, and he didn't really have a ton of experience with designing and producing a full-fledged title. He had a general concept, and he knew that he wanted to tap into Greek mythological settings as the backdrop of the game, but he didn't really know how to design and balance the gameplay associated with a title like that. Luckily for him, the R&D1 group, like I mentioned earlier, was one of the most senior groups at Sega, with a bunch of veteran design experience that Uchida was able to leverage as he went about creating his new game. Between their expertise and Uchida's overall vision, work on the title that would become known as Altered Beast officially got underway. While Uchida was able to rely on his teammates to help design and balance the actual gameplay of the title, Uchida himself was primarily focused on delivering a visual spectacle for players. In fact, he instructed his artists to spend 1 month on player transformations alone, setting aside all other work until they were able to design visuals that he believed would wow anyone who would put a quarter in the arcade machine. So, the artists sat down and worked exclusively on those transformations, after which they turned their attention to creating large, detailed character models with big, chunky, detailed sprites that practically screamed high-quality arcade visuals. To make those high-quality arcade visuals a reality, Uchida and his team would rely on the venerable System 16 Sega arcade board. It's been a while since we last spoke about arcade technology, so just by means of a refresher, arcade machines, unlike home consoles, did not often have interchangeable parts to facilitate swapping from one game to another within a given arcade cabinet. For the very first digital arcade machines of the 70s, literally every component needed for a given game would be soldered onto a series of control boards inside of the arcade cabinet, making any sort of alteration effectively impossible without a detailed knowledge of the schematics of a given machine. As the 80s progressed, arcade manufacturers started to get a little bit more intelligent about how they designed their machines. Rather than having every piece of hardware soldered onto and integrated with a series of control boards, arcade manufacturers began standardizing around certain systems, so to speak, with most games coming on daughter boards that would quote-unquote plug in to the central processing motherboard of the game. Using this engineering approach, arcade game studios could create a standard set of capabilities and features, such as the number of colors, overall processing power, sound chips, and things like that, which could all be utilized by any game designed for that particular set of capabilities. As arcade games evolved and technology improved, manufacturers could then update those core capabilities, leading to new system motherboards for future games to be built to utilize. Sega, as the most prolific arcade manufacturer ever, would develop around 35 different arcade systems over its lifetime, with different systems having different capabilities and features. In 1987, the most widely used Sega board was known as the System 16, which allowed designers to create large character models with a number of detailed sprites able to be displayed on screen at any one time. Those sprites could all have different graphical and mathematical effects applied to them, allowing characters and figures to effectively be deformed and redrawn in the blink of an eye, which is why Uchida knew that Altered Beast would be perfectly at home on the System 16 board. Beyond its own capabilities, there was also something else that made the System 16 board special. Engineers at Sega were hard at work on their next home console, a 16-bit powerhouse that would represent the most state-of-the-art home console ever created. The System 16 arcade board is what would form the foundation of the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive depending on where you live, and the goal with the Genesis was to bring the arcade experience into the living rooms of countless gamers around the world. So it would only stand to reason that basing the Genesis hardware on the most popular Sega arcade board of the time would make it easier to port those arcade experiences to the home console market. More on that in just a little bit. Returning our attention to Altered Beast, following a fairly typical development cycle, the arcade version of Altered Beast would release around the world in June of 1988, with the game achieving a fair degree of popularity. In Japan, the game would become the second highest grossing arcade game of July in 1988, and in the United States and Europe, Altered Beast would rise to even greater levels of popularity. Despite players wanting to experience the title, the overall critical response to the game was admittedly a bit mixed. While some publications praised the game's graphics, sound, and gameplay, others were decidedly less enthused, with one magazine even going so far as saying that the game was, and I quote, "not recommended to those that are still living." I gotta say, that's like a Gordon Ramsay level of critique for the title. Now, whether that critical whipping was warranted or not, the fact is that Altered Beast would remain a fairly popular arcade title even after its release, which is why, when Sega was trying to decide which title to bundle with their new Sega Genesis console in North America and Europe, Altered Beast was ultimately chosen to be the pack-in title for the console. That meant that if you were buying a Sega Genesis, at least until 1991, you were also buying Altered Beast. And the fact that you got Altered Beast, a prominent arcade title, for free with the purchase of a Sega Genesis, became a large part of Sega's early marketing push, as the company would tout the fact that the Sega Genesis was the only home console capable of replicating the arcade experience at home. Sure, other ports for arcade games may have existed for years, but according to Sega, never before were you able to truly get the same level of quality as an arcade title while in the comfort of your living room. And speaking of ports, beyond the Sega Genesis version of Altered Beast, which was widely considered to be the best home version of the game, due largely to the fact that the Sega Genesis was, like I mentioned, based on the System 16 arcade board, there would be a ton of other ports for Altered Beast, including those for the Sega Master System, PC Engine, Nintendo Famicom, Commodore 64, and Amiga, just to name a few. While all of those versions would be unique in various ways, the one unifying factor, according to many gamers, was that none of them could hold a candle to the arcade original, other than, of course, the Sega Genesis version of the title. With such a popular title, you might assume that Sega would turn Altered Beast into a franchise, though sadly, you would be wrong. While Altered Beast would receive 2 sequels in the early 2000s, neither of them ever received any degree of acclaim for the time, and one, the PlayStation 2 version of the title, ended up only having a limited release in Japan. While I can't relay my own opinion on those efforts, as I've never played them, the general consensus is that they were pale imitations of the original Altered Beast. That original version, though, would experience a number of re-releases over the years, including in various Sega game collections, one of the preloaded games on the Sega Genesis Mini, and as one of the games available on the Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pack service. With those re-releases came a whole slew of retrospective analysis, and the majority of those reviews were, well, they were not good. The majority of gaming publications claim that Altered Beast was interesting in concept, but simply does not hold up today. While one even went so far as to rank Altered Beast as one of the 10 worst Sega Genesis titles ever released. We'll go over my personal opinion of the title in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, regardless of how I feel, some of these critiques are really quite harsh. Which honestly is a bit unfair from my perspective. With Altered Beast, you have a title that represents the first effort by new game designer Makoto Uchida, and while I don't think anyone would claim the game is a deep, complex affair, there is sometimes goodness in simplicity. Uchida succeeded in creating a title that, at least for the time, was a popular, well-liked experience that added to the already gigantic Sega arcade pedigree of the 80s, while also adding some unique mechanics that had rarely been seen in games up to that point. While it may not have ever gotten the critical praise of some other classic arcade titles, the fact is that Altered Beast, as its own unique take on the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre, is a game that definitely deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Altered Beast today versus when it was released back in 1988, a good 36 years ago. So Altered Beast at its core is a fairly simple side-scrolling two-dimensional beat-em-up kind of experience. You control a mighty warrior who has risen from his grave, and your goal across 5 different levels is to move from the left of the screen to the right of the screen, beating up any enemies that might get in your way. Now, I recognize that that description sounds exceedingly simple, and honestly, the core gameplay mechanics of the game are admittedly pretty darn straightforward. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we'll see that there's actually a bit more to the overall experience than what might meet the eye at first glance. The general structure of the game and its world exists entirely on a two-dimensional plane, meaning that unlike other beat-em-ups released around this time, there is no ability to walk into or out of the screen. There is no depth to the game's movement, so you pretty much only have to worry about enemies and movement in either a directly vertical or directly horizontal direction. There are certain parts of different levels that utilize ledges to provide a height component to the experience, but you can think of those ledges as simply adding a secondary path through a given section of a level. When you do encounter those sections, you can usually move either onto the ledge or below the ledge at will, depending on the enemies you're currently facing and which path provides the greatest chance of success. Regardless of which path you may choose, you're going to be waylaid by enemies, and those enemies will display a surprising amount of diversity given the general simplicity of the rest of the game. You'll face humanoid zombies, mythological animals and arachnids, headless undead hordes, flying demons, charging boars, and a number of other bad guys that you'll need to dispatch as you play the game. Each of those enemies, for the most part, have a unique movement pattern, and if you intend to actually beat the game, you're going to need to spend some time learning those enemy patterns and exploiting opportunities to attack while avoiding taking damage yourself. Those enemies are spread across 5 auto-scrolling levels, each of which have their own environments and graphical features. You'll walk through an ancient graveyard, hidden caverns, and opulent palaces, and as you traverse each stage, you'll notice fairly quickly that there is no real randomness to any of the encounters. Similar to a lot of side-scrolling games from around this time, Altered Beast is an entirely predetermined affair, meaning, if you pay attention to each level as you play the game, you'll eventually learn where each enemy appears, when they begin their movement towards you, and what the right approach is to each encounter. And interestingly, you do in fact need to figure out the right approach to each section of each level, because the unique combination of enemies will create situations where, unlike many beat-em-ups, you'll actually need to have a strategy in order to be successful. Perhaps the most obvious spot where this comes into play is the third stage in the game, the Cavern of Souls. In this level, you'll be presented with a higher path and a lower path, with pits on the ground that could, potentially, cause an immediate death if you mistakenly fall down one. As you move through the stage, you'll notice some enemies that attack from the higher ledge down to the lower ground level, while other enemies simply attack on their current horizontal plane. As you play this level, you'll notice that avoiding damage is pretty tricky, until you realize that the best move early in the level is to duck down a couple feet from the edge of the upper ledge and time your upward kicks to hit the enemies as they jump down towards you. Doing this lets you move on in the stage without taking any damage, and once you get the timing right, the whole section becomes pretty trivial to deal with. That example is an admittedly small piece of the overall experience, but it is a demonstration of the fact that while Altered Beast plays like a beat-em-up, it actually has some more platformer elements that come into play fairly often. For those of you who have played a lot of platforming titles, you'll recognize that one of the keys to success in completing a platformer is gaining the appropriate knowledge and muscle memory of any given level, allowing you to progress through a stage while avoiding or defeating enemies that may be in your way, all while avoiding taking damage yourself. Many platformers rely on static level designs, where enemies, items, and obstacles do not change from one playthrough to the next, allowing your repeated playthroughs to eventually give you the experience and knowledge needed to finally beat the challenge in front of you. I mention all of this to make the point that Altered Beast is designed just like those static platformer experiences. When you reach a certain point in a stage, the same enemies will attack you at the same rhythm and with the same logic every single time you play that stage. Some people might look at something like that and claim that the game is too simple or that replayability might suffer. And to that I'd say, well, not really, or at least not right away. Because trying to figure out how to get through each stage in the most efficient way possible, while collecting all of the required power-ups to actually face the boss of the stage and beat the level, does require a bit of strategy, and at times, it almost felt like I was playing a very light puzzle kind of experience. It's nothing that'll tax anyone's brain, but it did give me a different feeling than what I expected going into a side-scrolling beat-em-up title. Anyway, the core goal of each level is to collect several orbs, each of which will increase your power until eventually you're able to transform into one of 5 mythical beasts, depending on which level you're currently playing. Each of these beasts grant you with special abilities that change how you play the game, and I thought each of those transformations added a nice jolt of diversity to the overall experience. Throughout your playthrough, you'll have the opportunity to turn into a werewolf, a flying dragon, a bear, a were-tiger, and as your final form, a golden werewolf. Some of these forms might increase your melee damage, while others give you new movement mechanics like flight, while others still allow you to unleash attacks that literally propel you across the entire screen, defeating any enemies that you happen to come into contact with. I enjoyed the power fantasy that came along with each of these forms, and I kinda wish there was more time in each stage that allowed you to play around with them, because each level is actually pretty darn short. At least assuming you gain your full power and can unleash your transformation. And in fact, the only way to reach the boss fight of each stage is to actually fully transform into your final form, and there are usually just enough orbs included in each level to get you to your final transformation without needing to repeat any section of a stage. Those orbs, by the way, are all carried by blue wolves, and you have to defeat those wolves in order for them to drop the orbs you need, which you then have to walk into in order to absorb their power. Once you realize how to beat each level and where each enemy spawns and attacks from, you shouldn't have too much difficulty collecting all of the orbs and making your way to the boss fight for that stage. Until you figure that out though, you may face certain stages where you miss an orb, which will make it so that you have to play through the stage again, oftentimes with new enemies showing up that you may not have even seen in your first walkthrough through the stage. From what I can tell, stages will repeat indefinitely until you acquire enough orbs to transform, so it does behoove you to find and defeat those blue wolves as quickly as possible. In your quest to retrieve those orbs, you'll likely take some damage along the way, and here the game implements a tiered health bar system of sorts. The way it works is you start each game with 3 full stacked health bars, and as you take damage, each health bar begins to deplete, eventually changing colors as your hit points dip lower and lower. If you end up getting hit too many times and lose all of your hit points, you'll die and lose a life, which will replenish your health bars as long as you have lives left to use. If you use up all of your lives, it's game over, and you have to restart the game from the very beginning of the first stage. That might sound harsh, until you realize that a full playthrough will take you around 15 minutes max, and that's if you miss some orbs along the way. Overall, having to restart when you lose all of your lives is not too bad, and it is certainly less painful than some other games that have graced classic consoles over the years. Before we move on though, I should mention that for this particular discussion, I played the Sega Genesis version of the title, which is widely regarded as the best home port for the game. The arcade version of Altered Beast will give you effectively the same gameplay experience, though the overall graphical and audio quality of the experience is decidedly better in the arcade version. That's not to disparage the Sega Genesis version, it's just recognition that arcade machines around this time were still more powerful than their home console counterparts. And we're going to talk more about Altered Beast and how it implements those home console features in just a minute. But first, as we usually do, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially around this time where you didn't have the internet, you didn't have YouTube and gameplay videos that you can refer to see if it was worth your time to look at or potentially buy a title. A lot of times around this time, all we had were magazine reviews we may have read, and the box staring us in the face at the video game store. If the box looked cool, if the back of the box sounded cool, we bought the game. If not, we just put it right back on the shelf. So, for Altered Beast, for the Sega Genesis, the back of the box says, Altered Beast 16-bit cartridge. Enter a time when men were warriors and gods ruled the world. A time of good against evil, a place of danger. Summoned by Zeus to rescue Athena, you will infiltrate the underworld with the power to transform into mythical creatures with supernatural strength. Level 1. Become a savage werewolf and use teeth and nails to shred your enemies to pieces. Capture 3 of the elusive spirit balls and you'll be transformed into a ferocious fireball-throwing werewolf. Level 2 and 3. Take flight as Were-Dragon and use fiery force to fry the followers of Neph. Creep across slippery crevices inside a deep cavern as the crafty Werebear. Level 4 and 5. Stalk the gates of the underworld fortress as a man-eating were-tiger, a predator with no pity. Inside the inner sanctum, call on Golden Werewolf's might to demolish Neph, the demon, forever. And then there are also some screenshots on the back of the box, and I've got to say, I don't know that this box really sells me on the experience. I've got a slight issue, and this is a personal perspective, but I've got a slight issue with game boxes that literally just lay out the entire gameplay experience as though that's the way you market your title. Sure, it's great to get that information, and it's great to be able to understand what is waiting for you if you buy that game. But I much prefer boxes that try to sell you on the idea of a game as opposed to just laying out what levels you're going to tackle and what you're going to do to get through those levels. It just feels like a little lazy marketing. I don't know. Maybe I'm in the minority here. This box, it just didn't really speak to me. The graphics looked fine for what it was, and certainly back around the late 80s when it came out. It came out in 1989 for the Sega Genesis. The graphics looked really good, but the box, I don't know that the actual marketing on the back of the box sold me on this title. I did not, in fact, own Altered Beast back around this time. I didn't get my first Sega Genesis until years later, and by that point, Sonic was the pack-in title. Actually, Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is the pack-in title that I got with my Sega Genesis, so I did not have Altered Beast back around when the Sega Genesis first came out. That being said, this box just didn't really sell me on the game. Anyway, let's move on from that. We're going to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, not the box, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. From my perspective, the graphics here look pretty darn good, especially considering that Altered Beast, like we were just talking about, is effectively the first Sega Genesis title, owing to the fact that it was the pack-in title for the system when it was first released. I enjoyed the design of each of the game's levels, which were pretty diverse from both a color and overall art style perspective. Character sprites, meanwhile, were nicely detailed, while also being larger than the sprite work you would typically see in traditional 8-bit titles that ruled the market when the Sega Genesis was originally released. In fact, despite not playing or owning the game when it was released, I do recall when the Genesis did first release here in North America, and I remember seeing Altered Beast in action fairly early on in the system's lifecycle. Now, I've relayed this story before, and I literally just mentioned it a second ago, but I was a Nintendo kid up until the early 90s. So while I had awareness of other consoles like the Genesis, I didn't really own any non-Nintendo consoles until around 1992. That said, as soon as I saw Altered Beast running, it truly did feel like the arcade experience finally was able to be replicated in the home. Typically speaking, those large detailed sprite character models were the purview of arcades in the 8-bit gaming era. With the advent of the Genesis, that level of detail could now be seen on television screens everywhere. Now, while that's purely nostalgia talking, even looking at the graphics today, the game looks pretty good. It'll never be mistaken for a modern title, but for a launch day arcade port, I feel like it got a lot of things right and adequately demonstrates what the Genesis was capable of, at least in comparison to its competition. Moving on to the sound and music, the only thing I can say about the sound and music here was that the game had sound and music. I honestly had to pull up a YouTube video just now to refresh my memory as to what the game's music sounded like, because from my perspective, the audio is simply not all that memorable. For what it's worth, I didn't have any complaints while I was actually playing the game, and after refreshing my memory as to what the music actually sounded like, I can say that at least a couple of tracks sounded pretty decent. But the thing with the music in the game is that it lacks any depth. It kind of sounds like a bunch of synthesized sounds clashing together with an overriding melody, but not a ton of structure beyond that. You know how games like Streets of Rage 2 made the Genesis sound like a techno band? Well, nobody would mistake Altered Beast's music for anything other than purely synthesized game music. I'm not saying it's bad, it's just not all that memorable or technically advanced in comparison to other Genesis titles that would follow. The one aspect of the sound that I do want to call attention to, though, is the digitized voice that will play at various points in the game. I'm not suggesting that digitized voice was high quality, because it wasn't, but I will say that it was cool to see this kind of feature included in a Genesis cartridge. Today it lacks some punch, but back in the late 80s, it was something truly unique. Moving on to the narrative and story. In Altered Beast, you control a recently resurrected warrior who needs to save the goddess Athena from certain doom, because Neph, the ruler of the underworld, has kidnapped Athena, and as a result, she is in grave danger. Zeus, Athena's father, doesn't take kindly to the kidnapping, and as a result, he identifies a champion, you, to combat the demonic hordes to save his daughter and defeat Neph, hopefully once and for all. For the style of game Altered Beast is, the story definitely works. There is just enough here to provide the motivation to actually play the game, and I appreciated how the story ties into ancient Greek mythology, albeit from a purely fictional lore standpoint. I don't think the game's story is going to win any awards, but it is perfectly reasonable for a short, simple action platformer beat-em-up title that originated in the arcades. Now, I should mention that unlike many beat-em-up games, Altered Beast does in fact attempt to tell a bit of a story as you play the game, which is done via the use of mini cutscenes that play out between levels. I think it is awesome that these cutscenes were included, but I've got to admit that I couldn't really decipher what was happening in each of those scenes. There was no dialogue or any sort of text, just several pictures with a bright purple-pink tint to them. You can kind of assume some things about what's going on, but if you didn't seek out the story of the game before actually playing the game, I don't know that you would really be able to interpret those scenes. Even knowing the story, I'm not entirely sure what those scenes were meant to depict in all instances, which honestly is kind of strange. That said, I still think it's a net positive that those cutscenes were included. I just don't know that they truly enhanced the game's story delivery. Moving on to the playability and controls, we talked a good bit about the overall structure of the game already, so I'm not going to rehash that here. What I will say, though, is that the game's control scheme, while simple, does have a bit of depth to it, especially when you consider the different powers included with your transformative forms. By default, you can punch, kick, and jump, with different attacks associated with crouching, standing, and jumping positions. The most unique attack in your base form, from my perspective, is the upward kick, which you can perform by ducking and pressing your kick button. Generally speaking, this move is useless when dealing with most enemies, though there are certain sections of the game where enemies attack from above you, and some bad guys even dive bomb you directly. In those instances, that upward kick is a lifesaver, though it does require some timing in order to actually hit the enemy and avoid damage for yourself. Otherwise, your base form is pretty straightforward. Your transformed forms, though, do add a good bit of diversity to the experience. Rather than punch, kick, and jump, each transformed form gives you access to other abilities, like flying attacks, massive damage punches, and even a spin move. Those abilities are unique to the specific transformed form that you might be using, and they all control well using a standard 3-button Sega Genesis controller, or your favorite modern controller that you might be using on the emulator of your choice. Overall, the game controls just fine, and I always felt like I had control of the action. The overall playability of the title, meanwhile, is simply fine. When you play Altered Beast, you know immediately that you're playing a game that was designed over 30 years ago, because there is a certain clunkiness to the gameplay that makes the game feel old. I don't think that's a showstopper though, and its clunky gameplay can occasionally even seem charming, depending on your own personal perspective. I will say that the game can be a bit difficult, driven largely by that clunky gameplay, but it doesn't take too long to figure out the game's quirks and eccentricities, after which you should have mostly smooth sailing. One aspect of the design that I will question though, is the necessity to be fully powered up before you're allowed to tackle a given stage's boss. This is one of those things that will likely feel entirely different depending on how familiar you are with the game's enemies and levels. Once you become proficient at the game, this really doesn't pose any issue, and you'll naturally power up simply by playing the game. Before you reach that level of proficiency though, you might feel a little put out with having to repeat certain sections of stages in the hopes of finding an additional power orb to consume. Otherwise, the game is a mostly playable experience with simple but effective controls. Once again, it's not going to win any awards for its gameplay, but it's also not offensive in any way either. So overall, how did it feel to play Altered Beast? Well, playing the game felt exactly like playing an arcade port from the late 80s, which is to say, Altered Beast is 100% a function of the time in which it was created. There's nothing here that's going to be remembered as being revolutionary, and there's nothing here that's going to make you think, oh, that was ahead of its time. But there is certainly something to like here, and I believe that its relative simplicity and lack of depth actually saves the title. If Altered Beast attempted to be a deep, epic game with tons of levels, the controls and overall gameplay would get old pretty darn quickly, and I believe it'd make the whole experience feel outdated and not all that fun to play. With only 5 levels though and 10 to 15 minutes of actual gameplay, it's actually a pretty fun experience, and if you go into it with the right mindset, meaning expecting a lightweight arcade-styled adventure, I think you'll walk away fairly happy. So what is our verdict on Altered Beast? Well, Altered Beast is not the kind of game that transcends time. It is, instead, the kind of game that exemplifies the time in which it was created, and as such, is almost like a time capsule into late 80s era arcade gaming and their related home ports. While I think your overall enjoyment of the title will vary based on your own personal nostalgia for that era of gaming, I still believe that Altered Beast deserves to be recognized as a golden oldie. This is not one of those games that will appear on many best games ever lists, and you know what? That's okay. Not every game has to be a sprawling, complex experience. Sometimes, simplicity itself can be enjoyable, and that's exactly what you get with Altered Beast, which is why, for me, Altered Beast is our newest addition to our list of golden oldies. That was our episode on Altered Beast. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways to reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you all to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be our next Sounds of the Classics episode. This one is going to be focused on point-and-click adventure games. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond memories of music from those kinds of titles. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts or harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you to make sure that I am hitting the mark with the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I am dedicated to making sure that I deliver the best possible podcast I can, and I truly do value the feedback that I receive from everyone in the community. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Sounds of the Classics, Point-and-Click Adventures Edition. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.